Well, good evening, everybody. I hear the silence has descended on us, so that must be time to start the event. Well, welcome to the American Philosophical Society. I see a lot of familiar faces, but also some new ones. My name is Patrick Spiro. I'm the incoming executive officer of the American Philosophical Society. It is, for those of you who are new to the APS, somewhat of a return for me. I'd spent several years as the librarian of the society, and before that as a postdoctoral fellow here. So I'm thrilled to be returning, and I'm really excited that the first lecture that I'm hosting is one that actually a project began during my tenure as librarian. So I'm thrilled to be here, and thank you, Bob, for writing this book. I'm going to say a lot more about it in a moment. But first of all, for all of those of you who are new here to the APS or are returning but need reminding, just want to tell you a little bit about who we are and what we do. We were founded by Benjamin Franklin in 1743. We were called the Philosophical Society because in the 18th century, philosophy then meant inquiry, especially into the natural world. And the idea was that the society could help support understanding the world in which we live, to use that knowledge to help us improve the world in which we live and also shape our future. And what I think is so fascinating about the society is in Franklin's proposal, he outlined 5 ways in which the society could advance knowledge in this way. And those 5 ways we still continue almost 300 years later. First off, he said the society needed to elect members, those who are helping advance knowledge in the colonies, scientists, humanists, and today we continue that tradition, electing over 850 members to the society. We have over 100 Nobel laureates who are members, and over 100 international members as well. So our network is not just national, but international. We also hold meetings twice a year here in Franklin Hall, where we bring together these members to share cutting-edge research in all different fields. If you look at our motto here, it's nullo discriminate. We don't discriminate. We believe any and all knowledge can help us improve our world. And if you come to our meetings, you'll see that. You could hear a concert, you could hear somebody talk about climate change in Madagascar, and you could hear somebody talk about the Civil War. We provide over $1.5 million in research grants a year. That's to send scholars here to our library to conduct research, but also the vast majority are going out across the globe conducting research. We give out over 200 grants at $5,000 a year, primarily to young scholars in early career stage. It's like incubating the future of knowledge, and that's what we do. We also have a library and museum. When Franklin created the APS, he said, the members have to correspond with each other, send letters to Philadelphia, share with us what you're finding. And from that origin, developed one of the largest independent research libraries in the United States. Today, we're home to over 14 million pages of manuscripts. We continue to collect. We have the papers of over 7 Nobel laureates. Michelle, how many do we have now? All right. I will say 8 for the official thing, but there might be some more in the offing, which is great. And of course, we have this museum that showcases our treasures, and I encourage you all to see our current exhibition on the history of natural history. And then finally, we have the press, and that's why we're all here tonight. We support the longest continuously operating scholarly press in North America. We've been saying that for a long time. No one's corrected us. It must be true, right? But our first, it was 1771 when David Rittenhouse published The Transit of Venus, which really established the idea that American scientists are on par with their European peers, and also established the APS as an international organization. We continue to publish today in books, in journals, and tonight we're celebrating one of our great accomplishments of this year, Bob Frishman in his book. I also want to acknowledge that tonight is also a night where we're marking a major transition at the press. For the last several years, I don't even know how long was it, Peter, at the end of the day? 2 years. Peter was going to take on an interim position as the director of our press as we replaced it. I think it was going to be maybe 6 months. And it morphed into 2 years in which Peter helped us think about the future of the press, how we can continue to serve the world by publishing. And he's created an incredible strategic plan and did incredible work getting the press ready for the 21st and beyond century. And now he's being replaced by Kim Gwinta, who is joining us, formerly at Rutgers University Press, where she was the deputy there. She's arrived just a couple of weeks ago, and we want to welcome Kim to the APS community. And tonight we get to celebrate one of these works. Bob Frishman may be familiar to all of you. I like to just think of him as the horological expert extraordinaire. Bob has worked on over 8,000 clocks, 1,700 vintage clocks, 8,000 timepieces. He has a distinguished record, which it takes up these 6 pages in front of me, including being a Silver Star Fellow, one of the highest honors of the National American Association of Watch and Clock Collectors. He's also a student and scholar of horology. He has organized a number of groundbreaking conferences at the Winterthur, at the Museum of Fine Arts, at the Henry Ford Museum, and at the Museum of the American Revolution up the street. And he's also written and published extensively on the history of clocks, clockmaking, what we think of as horology today, and served on a number of different boards. And the reason we're here tonight is to celebrate his most recent work of scholarship, which is the biography of Edward Duffield. And I don't want to steal too much of Bob's time here, because you're going to talk a lot about Duffield, but I want to give you all a little taste on both Duffield, but also what Bob has accomplished here. Edward Duffield is a name that's largely unrecognized today, but he was a man of importance in his day, and he shaped the world in which he lived, and I think he embodied that mission of the APS I was talking about. In fact, he was elected to the American Philosophical Society in 1768. He had a number of different roles. He maintained the State House clock for a period of time. Most notably, he designed a timepiece for the transit of Venus that David Rittenhouse observed, that the APS then published in their first publication, The Transactions, in 1771 that I mentioned. And he also served as the executor of Benjamin Franklin's will. He's somebody Franklin referred to as my ingenious friend. And what's so remarkable about Duffield, and something that I think is truly Bob's accomplishment here, is he was remarkable. He was important in his own day, but he left almost no record. And what Bob Frishman has done here is take these shards and resurrect Edward Duffield. And for that, Bob, we thank you and welcome, and please share more with us.
Whenever I get that kind of introduction, I'd say, I want to be that guy. You know, who's this Bob Frishman guy? Geez, well, someday when I grow up, maybe I can be that guy. And I guess I'm still pinching myself when I look at that beautiful book and see my name on it. It feels like I'm going to wake up and, you know, just be back in Andover, wishing that I could write and produce a beautiful book. So it's happened. And thank you very much, Patrick, for that. And thank you, Peter, too, for being such a strong advocate for this book as we went along. You know, I'm not sure it would have seen the light of day without you, so I appreciate everything, all the support you gave me when doing it. So, as you see, there's the book and its cover. I'm going to be reading this. Usually I just ramble on looking at the pictures, but I figure I've got a lot of information here, so you can pretend I'm not reading it, but I'm gonna roll along here, and I think that way we'll get all the information in that I'd like to. So, and thank you, Patrick, for that introduction. But right away, I must thank the Edward W. Kane and Martha J. Wallace Family Foundation. Ed Kane generously underwrote the entire production of this book. I'm sorry he can't be with us this evening. I hope he's watching online. I contributed my time and labor, but his foundation funded all of the other costs. Proceeds from the book sales go to the APS, so you may keep this in mind when buying the book or 10 books here tonight or later on. I invited Ed to write the book's preface, and in it he described his deep interest in early American clocks and why he supports research and publications about them. Let's see, there we go. Ed, too, is a writer about antique clocks. He published this excellent article in the recent August issue of Maine Antique Digest. I should mention, too, that I've been at this podium before. In October of 2021, the first lectures were presented here for the Horology 1776 Symposium that I created and organized for the National Association of Watch and Clock Collectors. Patrick welcomed us at Franklin Hall. There he is. I don't know why there isn't a picture of Duffield up there, but I guess it was too soon for that. He spoke about the APS and its horological holdings as well as describing this wonderful organization. So thank you again, Patrick, for introducing APS and us back in 2021. So here I am again on this stage. My talk this evening, not simply readings from the book, is intended as an introduction and a companion to my book. I hope you'll find it interesting and enticing. You'll see a large selection of images from the hundreds that I've collected during my research. I'll be showing them quickly as we go along. If you'd like to look longer at any of them, please ask me or arrange to view a recording of this presentation. Oh, you know, I forgot to, if in my briefcase is, I'm going to come get that. I'm back. All right, so, and if we say a picture is worth 1,000 words, then perhaps the actual object is worth 1,000 pictures. So I'm passing around an antique brass and steel clock movement for each of you to handle during my talk. Don't worry, you can't break it. Although this old one is a bit simpler than most of the ones made by Edward Duffield 2.5 centuries ago, it's good for you to view it closely and to feel its cool, smooth metal as Edward would have and as I still do at my bench. Auspiciously, in the 1952, the year I was born, the June issue of the magazine Antiques had a clock on the cover. Better yet, inside was a quote by its longtime editor, Alice Winchester. Her words eloquently summarize my book's themes. And I'm not going to read from the screen except for now, because I don't like that, but this is particularly relevant, and I'm happy that Alice Winchester wrote this the year I was born. Collectors of antiques are likely to think of clocks as furniture rather than as timekeepers. They pay considerable attention to the case, but little or none to the mysterious mechanism within, though that is actually the clock, and in most cases the only part of the whole thing made by the man whose name appears on the dial. Cases were made by cabinet makers, dials were usually imported, and the product of the clockmaker was the hidden work. It's these complex devices that concern the true clock collector, and the story of their development and the growth of clockmaking industry in America is a fascinating one indeed. So I kept this quote right handy as I was researching this because it's so important and relevant. So my biography of Edward Duffield is a story of a highly skilled 18th century Philadelphia clockmaker, but it's much more than that. We all know that his city and the years that he lived were among the most important in the history of colonial America and of the early United States. Highly appropriate for the APS and us here this evening, as Patrick told us, Edward was elected to its membership in 1768, along with many other luminaries of his day, and you see some of those names here. So I have to say I'm proud that my book bears the APS imprint and that I'm connected even remotely with these good people. A year after Edward's election, the APS commissioned him to make a high-accuracy regulator clock to time a rare transit of the planet Mercury, not Venus, that was earlier, across the face of the sun. This was the short time after the more famous and highly anticipated transit of Venus that was observed worldwide and by his friend Rittenhouse. So this regulator is still in the APS collection, and this image is the first of several full pages I'll show from my book's catalog section, where 71 Duffield clocks and instruments are described and illustrated. This is the clock's fine movement, crafted by Edward in just 3 weeks. It is time only, no hourly striking, as such regulators need it to be, so the striking system would not interfere with the machine's accuracy. This movement is a version, although larger, of the one that's now being passed around. Each has the same system, for example, of maintaining power that kept the clock ticking while the weight was being wound up. We see Edward's city in 1754. The pink-shaded area is the central location of Edward's house and shop at the corner of Mulberry, later renamed Arch, and 2nd Streets. William Penn wanted his streets all named after trees, but somehow maybe Mulberry, they didn't like the name and they changed it to Arch because there was an arch down at the end of the street. But Edward was not a typical leather-apron colonial artisan. He was an affluent 18th century urban craftsman deeply involved in the economic, civic, and religious life of Philadelphia. Our mechanic was born wealthy. His grandfather Benjamin arrived from England in 1678 at the time of Philadelphia's founding, 4 years before William Penn stepped off the Welcome and saw his new colony for the first time. Benjamin, not a Quaker, was among the crowd that greeted Penn, who had survived a smallpox breakout on the ship that killed a third of the passengers. But Penn had had smallpox as a child, so that's why he remained healthy and was able to help nurse the people who were afflicted by smallpox on the ship. So Benjamin became a wealthy tanner, builder, and landowner. He left much of his property to his grandson, Edward. The 6-year-old boy somehow survived a family tragedy in 1736, perhaps also smallpox, that swiftly killed his mother and 4 brothers during 10 terrible late summer days. He was raised by his grandfather, father, 2 sisters, and stepmother, but served no known apprenticeship other young men needed to. You see a 1741 indenture of Emmanuel Rouse, who was apprenticed to the famous Philadelphia clockmaker Peter Stretch. You'll later hear me talk a little bit more about those 2 men. As an adult artisan, Edward rarely advertised his wares or services, and he was a member of the city's social and financial elite. He was entrusted to sign local paper currency, each one requiring 3 original signatures. And I think the print one was usually, for this, was about 18,000. So these guys were pretty busy writing their names on the paper currency. This 15-shilling bill was issued in 1769, as you see, for relief and employment of the poor. I continue to search for one of these with Edward's signature. If anyone here has one, please let me know. Supposedly there was one at the Independence Hall Park, but Carrie was unable to find it. So I'm still hoping to find one myself someday. So Edward served on public boards, commissions, and grand juries. If that's for me, tell him I'll call him back. So, all right, good, thank you. He was a member, vestryman, and warden of the city's most important Anglican place of worship, Christ Church, along with many of the city's mostly prominent non-Quaker leaders. I'll be speaking in that sanctuary of the historic church next Tuesday evening, being able to point out where Edward sat, with much of the same content as you hear tonight, but with more details about Edward's church activities. Throughout his life, Edward paid substantial taxes on many holdings, including land, horses, coaches, rental housing, and small numbers of enslaved workers. This is his city assessment in 1767, placing him in the upper percentile of personal wealth, and it does not include all his properties outside of the city. Benjamin Franklin, then in England, nominated Edward along with Francis Hopkinson, a signer of the Declaration of Independence, to oversee Philadelphia's Bray Associate School for African American children. Another Bray school was in Virginia, and its rediscovered building is being restored at Colonial Williamsburg. In a letter to the Bray Associates in London in 1774, although Hopkinson usually was the correspondent, in this case, this letter was from Edward himself. He reported on the school students, and these are his words. There are at present 2 at their needles and spelling, 1 at knitting, needle and testament, 7 at spelling, 3 in the testament, 1 in the psalter, 10 in the alphabet, 1 in fables, 3 in the primer. 3 of the above children are free, and the rest of them are slaves. So Clockmaker Edward worked in a highly prestigious trade for a quarter century. He provided costly clocks, watches, instruments, and horological services. Oh, let's go back. This is one of his clocks. And horological services to the city's prosperous citizens and institutions. But unlike most of his fellow artisans, he had no financial pressures to endure long hours at arduous tasks, nor was he critically impacted by economic disruptions. He could study, he could work, he could engage in many unpaid activities without fear of poverty. 45 years old in 1775, he retired from horology and moved 10 miles north to live and farm on his large estate, Benfield, named after his grandfather. This is the only known photo of Benfield that was demolished in 1898. Perhaps he was like his leather-apron friends, printer Ben Franklin and cabinet maker Jonathan Gosselow. Each of them gave up manual labor when they'd reached their 40s. Despite Franklin extolling always about the virtue of hard work, I think he got a little sick of getting his hands inky all the time. So for Edward, there was the lure of a healthier, quieter life in the country estate. His wife, Catherine, may have had something to say about it. Perhaps he was tired of horology's many challenges, but other realities for Edward were just as likely. There was the escalating conflict. Let's see, sorry, I didn't show you Benfield, but there it is. I was seeing it perfectly on my screen. So that's Benfield. I'm sorry it's not there anymore, but I guess even stone houses get knocked down. It seems surprising, but this is no longer there. So reasons why he probably moved away: the escalating conflict with Britain affected both his market and for his services and the availability of English supplies, and growing number of local competitors. You see John Dupuy in 1770 was nearly next door to Edward on his same street, and Dupuy paid extra to the printer for a clock face to draw attention to his newspaper ads. As you may know from looking at old newspapers, rarely are there any graphics. It's mostly print. So after Edward's move to the countryside, tax records listed him as a farmer, not a clockmaker. 1793 document identified him as the late clock and watchmaker. The vocation was not inscribed 10 years later on his gravestone that we will see later on. And yet Edward produced some of the finest floor-standing clocks in 18th century North America. Several of them are prominently exhibited at world-class institutions. This is the elegant Duffield clock that stands at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It was donated to honor the retirement of longtime Americana curator Morrison Heckscher. We see Maury speaking at another NAWCC symposium that I organized, this one back in 2016 at Winterthur. The Baltimore Museum of Art has a Duffield clock. This clock at the Worcester Art Museum was gifted in 1946 by Judge John M. Woolsey, whose little round face you see here. You may know of Judge Woolsey's 1933 ruling that allowed James Joyce's book Ulysses to enter the country. And maybe he wrote that ruling while he was looking at the Duffield clock. Colonial Williamsburg has an outstanding Duffield clock, and so does the Library Company of Philadelphia. I hold the Library Company's share, this is their clock, I hold their share number 8, which was originally issued in 1731 to Joseph Stretch, a son of clockmaker Peter Stretch. Joseph, however, was in another line of work, hat making, but that's as close as I could get. Someone does own the original Duffield share, but he isn't giving it up, so yet. 2 more clocks are in the APS collection. This may be a clock that was unnamed in Franklin's estate inventory. The other is a non-striking timepiece that was donated by the sons of J.P. Morgan. It may also be in that estate inventory. Richard Bache married Franklin's daughter, and this clock was passed down through their descendants, as noted on the engraved silver plates attached to the case door. Other Duffield clocks in their mahogany and walnut cases stand in house museums, historical societies, and private collections. I visited many of these during my 5 years of research and writing on the book. This 9-footer oversees a conference room at Columbia University. I examined it with my dapper friend, Manhattan clockmaker John Metcalf. Although Edward never advertised as an engraver, he produced dies for the first 2 commemorative medals issued in colonial America. Both were created in 1757 and were struck by local silversmiths. The first one was an Indian peace medal commissioned by Quakers to encourage peaceful relations with Native Americans. So again, this is a die that Edward engraved for striking on metal, and you see the Native American and the colonist are sitting around a council fire there. Chiefs displayed these medals on their chests, as we see in this portrait by Henry Inman. These peace medals continued right up almost till the Civil War, when they were given to Native American chiefs as we were stealing their land and moving them away. But I suppose maybe the medal meant something to them. Ironically, though, the second medal was ordered by city leaders to celebrate the colonial militia's destruction and massacre of a Native American village at Katanning near Pittsburgh. On this, you can see the flames of the burning houses. Edward also made and engraved surveying compasses. 7 are illustrated and described in my book's catalog. 2 are in the APS collection. 1 was featured in the recent Mapping a Nation exhibit. I hope some of you saw that great exhibit, and on the cover of the APS magazine. So clearly APS is proud not only of its 3 clocks, but of its 2 Duffield surveying instruments as well. In the APS Mason-Dixon papers, there are 2 references to Edward repairing and making precision instruments. He was paid in April 1761 for 1, as well as for making 2 associated spirit levels and for some related work on iron and wood. Edward was an expert in building construction and design, perhaps learned from his grandfather's many ventures in real estate development. He designed a new schoolhouse for the Lower Dublin Academy. This is the only one of his buildings still standing. I have a picture of it, but the place is kind of a wreck, and I thought maybe it's better for you to imagine it as a nice-looking building. He oversaw the construction of Philadelphia's innovative new Walnut Street jail that was designed, to be more into rehabilitation and airier than normal dungeons of the time. But in a twist of fate, he was briefly incarcerated in that same jail during the British occupation of Philadelphia. He was living out at Benfield, but their dragoons had forayed out of the city and captured him along with several other men in the countryside beyond the military boundaries. Thomas Paine sent a letter to Franklin about the incident. The author of Common Sense also wrote about staying at Benfield with Duffield and about the loss of Franklin's furniture during the months when his Philadelphia home was occupied and looted by the Redcoats. Later in the 18th century, Edward designed his estate's 2-story stone barn built on German rather than English patterns that became a model later for many Pennsylvania barns. His barn has been gone for more than a century, but a similar one from the same era remains at Stenton nearby, the former mansion of city leader James Logan. Hope some of you have toured that wonderful historic house. But except for these buildings, the clocks and the instruments bearing his name, they're just shadows, footprints in the sand about the life of Edward Duffield. Intensive research now and in the past, including by the father of Sean Quimby, who's here tonight, Ian Quimby, who did a doctoral thesis at Winterthur on Duffield back in the 1950s. We've unearthed only a handful of primary materials. We have no diaries, no ledgers, no account books, unless they turn up later tonight when the descendant says, I have them, Bob. But that's always the biographer's nightmare and opportunity. So, so we have none of those ledgers, account books like this one, kept by early 18th century Philadelphia cabinet maker John Head. The APS preserves this handwritten treasure, and its pages served as a springboard for my friend Jay Stiefel's fine book published in 2019 by the APS. I hope that many of you own this book. And Jay has been a tremendous friend to me during this entire project, and I'm sorry he can't be here either tonight. He's still in England. I guess some people figure they got to get that far away so they have an excuse not to come. But anyway, thank you, Jay, if you're watching. He was a great friend and a great help on this project. But we know nothing of Edward's upbringing. We know nothing about his education and training, why he chose horology, no clockmakers in Edward's family, nor in his ancestry in the English village of Duffield in Derbyshire. Neither of his grown sons followed in his footsteps. Benjamin became a respected physician, bravely caring for the sick and dying during Philadelphia's disastrous yellow fever epidemics in the 1790s. Many people fled, including many physicians. Benjamin Duffield stayed. Thousands of residents perished, including many clockmakers. Edward's second son, Edward Jr., was a gentleman farmer who never married. His miniature portrait on ivory, painted in 1790 by James Peel, the brother of Charles Wilson Peel, was sold at an antique show shortly before I began this project. So sadly, I don't have it. I'm sad, too, that I discovered no formal portraits, miniature or large, of Edward or his wife. He certainly could have afforded them. Perhaps they do exist somewhere, staring from a living room wall or hanging unidentified in some art collection. So how did Edward become a clockmaker like this elegant fellow pictured in 1748? I can propose a reasonable scenario. Given his family's affluence, he's not going to be bound to an apprenticeship under a demanding master. For general education, he probably was privately tutored, as was William Franklin, Benjamin's illegitimate son, who was born just 2 months before Edward. The boys must have been well acquainted. There were tutors, advertising and teaching, as we see in this 1743 notice when Edward was 13 years old, and perhaps already tinkering. He may have been drawn to horology through intellectual curiosity, inspired and encouraged by Ben Franklin's wide-ranging interests. Fortunately for us, Franklin did not convince him to become a printer. During past centuries, a passion for horology has captured many people, young and old, including Henry Ford, King George III, and tens of thousands of members of the National Association of Watch and Clock Collectors. I got the passion in 1980. We all have been enchanted by lifelike machines with ticking heartbeats, shining faces, and gesturing hands. Edward reached adulthood in 1751, and he married earlier than most could afford to at that time. He began as a food merchant at the home he inherited and then occupied for the next 24 years. In just 2 lines of print, between other advertisers' notices for ship arrivals, and at the bottom there, Rhode Island cheese, he offered anchovies, olives, lemons, and capers. He placed this same ad for the next 2 weeks, but omitted the capers. Maybe they were sold out. The next year, in 1752, he was one of the first to sign and place his red wax seal on the subscription for Franklin's new fire insurance company, the Philadelphia Contribution Ship for the insurance of houses from loss by fire, the first company of its kind. Insured buildings mounted this numbered logo plate on a street-facing wall. Edward later became one of the company's long-serving directors. Still in business today, it maintains digital archives that provide surveys of insured properties all the way back to the beginning. This is Edward's boyhood home, sold by his family to the widow Cunningham, and is documented with its 17-foot frontage and 37 feet of depth. His adult home, 2 adjoining houses, was surveyed by local architect and builder Joseph Fox. So thanks to these old yellow papers, we can picture Edward's domiciles inside and out. None of them indicate a shop area, but I'm not sure if that was on purpose or was done for others as well, because I've seen these same records for other clockmakers and again didn't indicate a shop space. In 1800, artist William Birch published his colored prints of Philadelphia. None showed Edward's homes, but 2 get very close. Down this view of 2nd Street at my red line was Edward's corner. In this view, the artist must have been standing on Arch Street, just up from 2nd, perhaps by Edward's door. Pause is there today, clearly not occupying Edward's original buildings. When Edward first moved to that busy corner, he may already have been working on timepieces and instruments. He could have been learning from locals like Peter Stretch and his son Thomas, who lived just steps away. They are the subjects of this book by my friends Don Fenimore and Frank Holman. But not until 5 years later, at age 26, was Edward first publicly identified as a watchmaker in this newspaper ad. In it, he simply was informing the public that he had confiscated a silver spoon. He probably had no need to advertise. He had ready access to the city's upper crust, who knew him from his family's civic and church connections. Another 6 years passed until at age 32 in 1762, he was named to the prestigious position of maintaining the public clock in the Pennsylvania State House, now Independence Hall. Edward took over from the clocksmaker Thomas Stretch, whose machine drove the clock dials at each end of the building with long shafts connected to the centrally mounted movement. As we see, the dial at one end of the building was in the form of a giant grandfather clock. It was recreated and is still there today. I don't know how many of you have noticed that. I've walked by it, but when I was looking for it, there it was. In 1829, the Thomas Stretch clock movement that Edward maintained all those years was relocated from the State House to the nearby steeple of St. Augustine's Catholic Church. However, sadly, it cannot be examined today. In 1842-44, anti-Catholic rioters burned down the church and destroyed everything in it. Witnesses at the scene reported that the clock's bell pealed 10 o'clock for the final time as flames engulfed the belfry. This folk art painting by John Hilling shows another Catholic church, this one in Bath, Maine, being torched at about the same time by a mob of know-nothings. As we see on this tower's clocks, 9 o'clock would be the last time this clock's bell rang the hours. This photo shows a similar iron frame movement, not burned up, from the same period. So it looks probably like what Duffield was maintaining. It ticked in the tower of a church in Newburyport, Massachusetts. A friend bought this at auction and allowed me to take some pictures of it in his garage. The later tower of the State House clock held the next clock, made and installed in 1828 by Isaiah Lukens, who probably Duffield knew earlier. About 20 years ago, that movement was discovered looking like this in Germantown. It was restored and returned to the National Park in 2008 by clockmaker John Spencer, who you see here, but it was only for display and was not reinstalled in the tower. Today, a stalwart replacement still ticks, made for the 1876 centennial by the Seth Thomas factory in Connecticut. So Edward maintained Stretch's public clock for 13 years until passing the job to his more famous Philadelphia colleague, David Rittenhouse. Another recent Fenimore Homan book focuses on this famous Philadelphian. And as you can see, this was probably not only a prominent, prestigious position, but everybody in the whole city would know if you messed up, because that was the clock they were looking at and listening to. So there was probably some stress involved in maintaining the public clock of the city. So these books that you've been seeing are all in my personal horological library, now numbering more than 1,000 volumes. I call this a good start. Edward was described as a reading man, and he probably had a significant library himself, although his friend Franklin reportedly had the largest personal library in the North American colonies. Whether or not Edward had as many horology books as I do, and at the risk of me imposing contemporary hindsight, I can speculate that Edward's path may in some ways echo my own road to horology. At age 28 in 1980, while working as a speechwriter and press secretary for Congresswoman Shirley Chisholm, I was introduced to horology by a chance meeting. You may recall Mrs. Chisholm's historic campaign for the presidency in 1972, but this was well before I joined her staff 8 years later. My hobby grew until it blossomed a dozen years later into a full-time profession. Like Edward, I was mentored but not apprenticed, mostly on my own. I studied, practiced, broke things, and eventually had antique clocks ticking reliably in my home-based shop. However, Edward got proficient at clockmaking. We're glad that he did. And we can be sure that Edward is, for most horologists then and now, repairing and selling, not making, consume most of his days. This is one of the few receipts we have in his own handwriting, charging Joseph Shippen, a local well-known merchant, in 1767 for a new best silver watch and an extra glass crystal that came with it. Many upper-class homes, like the 1765 Powell House that I walked by on my way here today, had valuable clocks standing in hallways and on landings. These and other luxury goods often were British imports that were considered superior to local products. Many of the gentlemen and ladies who lived in these comfortable homes carried gold and silver pocket watches, like this fine 1715 example crafted by London's George Graham. For Edward, cleanings and repairs of clocks and watches like this would have provided much steadier work than an occasional order for a new clock. Even if we find more of Edward's clocks, his sales of new ones could have been no more than 2 to 5 clocks per year, hardly enough to keep him busy. Regarding Edward's other substantial sources of income, we know quite a lot from public records about his lands, buildings, possessions. We know about the public and church bodies on which he served and about the charities he supported. He was the manager of the 1767 lottery. Yes, government-sponsored lotteries were big fundraisers back then, too. I guess the payouts weren't in the billions, but people won them. And this one promised large cash prizes and only a 15% take for the sponsors. We know the births, marriages, baptism, and deaths in his family, but we have only the vaguest hints about Edward himself. No descriptions of his height, weight, hair color, demeanor, or voice. We do know what he wore, based on ledger pages kept by his upscale tailor. Joseph Graysbury's account book in the collection of the Historical Society of Pennsylvania listed 99 articles of clothing purchased by Edward between 1765 and 1773 for himself, his 2 sons, and his Negro man. Some of his outfits may have looked like what John Cadwallader is wearing in this 1772 family portrait by Charles Wilson Peale. We may know what Edward in his youth looked like. Let's see, there he is. Sorry, I gave my punchline away here. But we may know what young Edward, in 1921, The Museum of Fine Arts in Boston purchased a portrait attributed to Swedish-born Pennsylvania artist Gustavus Hazelius. It was inscribed as a likeness of Edward Duffield. Art experts later rejected the Hazelius attribution. Then they questioned the sitter's identity because Edward's name was written on the wooden stretcher, not on the back of the canvas. The afternoon I learned about this portrait, I was ready to rush to the museum in Boston. Oddly enough, I'd been there that very morning. Then came the bad news. The portrait had been deaccessioned in 1986. Here it is. I placed advertisements seeking its whereabouts, but I had no replies. The painting had been in the collection of Edward Duffield Ingram, a grandson of our Edward. He was a respected Philadelphia lawyer, but he also was notorious as an official enforcer of the Fugitive Slave Act. He sent many captured escapees back to bondage. His death in 1854 was widely celebrated by abolitionists. Sorry, any other descendants? Another descendant, Edward Duffield Neal, was Edward's great-grandson. He wrote extensively about his family's history, and his research was important to my own. But this man, an ordained minister and secretary to President Lincoln in the White House, also has a troubled reputation. He was the founder and first president of Macalester College in St. Paul, Minnesota. Yet his name, as you see here, recently was removed from one of the school's main buildings. Objections were raised about his desecrations of Native American graves and his refusal to allow women students in his classes. There is a descendant in the audience, and I promised that I wouldn't go on any longer about his notorious descendants. I'm sure most of them were and are lovely people, as these are. Back to Edward's portrait, its next owner was Eli Holden, a prominent Philadelphia watchmaker who doubtless appreciated a portrait of a well-known predecessor. The portrait then came to the Boston Museum via a dealer from Holden's heirs. Edward may be the subject of an old drawing that was shared with me by one of his descendants in Mississippi. Family lore claims that this is Edward. The drawing accompanied an incomplete Duffield movement that the family owned and recently donated to the APS. Edward's little watch papers, perhaps printed by Franklin, were pressed into the backs of pocket watch cases to repel dust and to remind watch owners about who sold and serviced their timepieces. Many watchmakers use this, and many collectors today now treasure them. On the small paper disc, Edward stated that there was a dial sign at his shop's location. One of the stories often told about Edward is that he made a large, unique two-sided clock to hang outside of his shop. Supposedly, Franklin suggested it so that Edward would not constantly be bothered by visitors entering the shop to ask the time of day. However, I can find no contemporary reports about this outdoor timepiece, as I would expect, given its prominence and uniqueness. The anecdotes about it appeared in print only decades later. Perhaps it was the more typical painted trade sign that tells the right time just twice a day. Only 2 letters are known that were written directly to Edward. Neither was from his friend Ben Franklin, who we know was a great letter writer. One letter in 1765 was from the minister and colonial secretary Richard Peters, who was a leader of Philadelphia's Anglican congregations. He was considered the most learned man in the colony. In his letter, Peters wrote to Edward, "You have distinguished me in so friendly and open a manner that I owe you everything that love can do where it meets with love." So this clearly was somebody who highly valued Edward Duffield. The second letter to Edward, more businesslike and with no mention of love, was from Franklin's sister, Jane Meekum. She wrote to Edward after her brother's death in 1790. Many period newspaper advertisements are reproduced and transcribed in my book. They demonstrate the offerings and increasing numbers of Edward's local competitors. A modern reference book lists about 150 Philadelphia watchmakers and clockmakers who were active during Edward's time. I collected relevant newspaper ads from soon after Edward's birth in 1730. In 1736, Francis Richardson offered very good clocks and mechanical roasting jacks that turned meat on a spit in the hearth. When Edward was just 17, Elias Boudinot advertised clockmaking and watch repair by Emmanuel Rouse, whose apprenticeship with Peter Stretch I mentioned previously. The next year, when Edward was selling capers, Benjamin Bagnall Jr. arrived from Boston, moving away from his more famous clockmaking father. The son offered clocks with cases or without. In 1756, when Edward's ad first called himself a watchmaker, Henry Flower was right there on 2nd Street, also with the dial trade sign. Appealing to the richest customers, who often preferred English-made goods, William Ball in 1760 advertised London watches and clocks with the maker's true name on them. Yes, there were fakes back then too. Lawrence Ashe, late from Mr. Duffield, provides the one hint that Edward employed an apprentice or journeyman in his shop. John Lind took over Edward's shop at Arch and 2nd Streets in 1775 when Edward moved to Benfield. As we see, this German immigrant who Americanized his name from Johannes was seeking an apprentice. So my book is not just Edward's story. It explores the nature of colonial clockmaking and watchmaking in the 18th century. At least a half century before Edward's maturity, the craft based in England, France, and Switzerland already relied on divisions of labor to produce finished and unfinished components. This truly was the beginning of globalized production and trade in manufactured goods, so familiar to us today. Dozens of specialized craftsmen were employed in fashioning clock and watch parts. Few American or European makers were making clocks solely by themselves from raw brass and steel. For watches, even fewer makers had the ability, the tools, or the desire to make those from scratch. Edward had easy access to local and imported horological goods that were much easier to buy than to make. In 1752, when Edward was just starting out, a local brass founder, you see here, offered work in the rough for clockmakers. We see fellow clockmaker and merchant John Wood selling parts in 1771, and Timothy Barrett doing the same 2 years later, a few steps from Edward's shop. These parts were equal in quality to parts Edward would otherwise have needed to laboriously cast, cut, turn, scrape, file, and drill by tedious hand labor. Edward's clock movements differ in no significant ways from those by other colonial and British artisans. Small dissimilarities among Edward's movements that I've viewed and looking at many of them, when he would more reasonably have made his parts exactly the same, could indicate multiple sources for those parts. In my book, I discuss and illustrate Edward's movements and compare them to others. This is a Duffield movement that I serviced, disassembled and identified part by part. Each of his movements is in the standard English style and quite possibly of English origin. These 8-day movements, meaning weekly winding, are actually two machines in one, each powered by heavy weights hanging below. If a weight were just dropped, its energy would be gone in an instant with a loud crash. Instead, the power is reduced through a train of gears and metered out over the week's run, providing just enough power to swing the pendulum 1 tick per second and count the hours on the bell for the household to hear. I own a japanned English tall clock signed by Joseph Harding of London. It dates to about 1760, when Edward was also in the business. I hope you're all memorizing this so you can make your own clock when you get home. I compared that movement's components to one of Edward's, and they are quite alike. I've serviced and studied hundreds of these similar English and American tall clock movements over the past 40 years. Here are photos of Duffield and Harding escape wheels. Harding has my Sharpie's red dot on it, and you can see that the wheels are basically the same. There's one outlier that may be Edward's earliest known clock. It's mechanically simpler than his 8-day versions, and its daily wind, one-hand movement and dial looked like the old-fashioned timekeepers that still were common in his day. The unusual boxy case was restored with that folky paint job about 20 years ago. Older auction photos of the clock show a bare pine case. George Eckhart, in his classic Pennsylvania Clocks and Clockmakers, reminded us that clockmakers using outsourced parts was only a start of the complex process. What these men bought was far indeed from a finished clock. Even though a clockmaker could buy parts, his resourcefulness was often taxed. So Edward likely assembled and finished clock movements like the 4 you see here from rough prefabricated components. This implies no denigration of his horological skills. This task required substantial expertise, experience, and specialized tools of the trade. But producing an entire movement from raw materials during Edward's years was decidedly inefficient, old-fashioned, and obsolete. Regarding his clock's composite brass dials, they were standard and indistinguishable from the faces that were fit to other makers' movements. English-made dials were easily purchased and quite difficult to fabricate without different and specialized training and equipment. We here can compare a Duffield dial with 3 others from the period that were signed by colonial and British makers. Edward almost certainly signed or engraved his name on his dials. The ornate signatures mostly are identical. I do document 4 very unusual Duffield dials that I've discovered. These have revolving spherical lunar indicators. This rare feature is found on a small number of earlier English clocks, such as a 1720 London clock by Joseph Williamson, but Edward's system for rotating the metal globes was different and simpler. He adapted standard dials to his design to offer a unique upgrade. I know of no other early American clocks with these black and silver lunar balls revolving slowly in the dial arch. Like nearly all watchmakers then and now, the title signified a repairer of watches. Very few colonial watchmakers could craft a multitude of tiny parts and create a functional watch, nor would there be any reason for them to do so. Only top-level watchmakers like Daniel Quare, whose beauty we see here, had the necessary skills and rich customers, but even much of their work was contracted out to specialists. Colonial watchmakers mostly sold and serviced English-made watches like this one, 1761, with the owner's 12-letter name, Samuel Morris, spelled out on its personalized dial rather than numbers. So, and if you have 12-letter name, you can have a customized watch made like this. This unusual watch is in the collection of the Philadelphia Museum of Art. Colonial watchmakers sometimes engraved their own names on the back plates of these imported movements. Edward probably did this on watches, identified as his in 2 published notices of missing watches. This ad could indicate that Edward signed at least 12 such watch movements. So Alice Winchester reminded us at the start of my talk that Edward did not make his clocks elegant wooden cases. Had Edward ever written an autobiography, it definitely would not have been a book about Philadelphia case making or Philadelphia furniture making. In Edward's time, the word clock usually signified only the movement and dial. In inventories, the case was named separately, clock and case, and ordered separately by the purchaser. Edward probably collaborated in decisions about the cases. He needed to be sure that his machine and dial would fit properly inside the cabinet. He may have discussed with the customers and woodworkers the choices of woods and the levels of quality and ornamentation. The bulk of his time he spent repairing, not making, also in no way lessens our respect for Edward's expertise. As I can assure you, after 4 decades of bench work, there's nothing easy or routine about repairing intricate mechanical devices. We can see here the reason why a recent repair job of mine quickly got complicated. A gear tooth had snapped off, and the adjacent tooth is bent and ready to break as well. Edward certainly faced similar surprises. And I suppose one of the questions can be, how did you fix that, Bob? But I can't tell you, that's a secret. Even today, a movement overhaul can be plagued by malfunctions, errors, accidents, defective parts, lengthy troubleshooting, dreaded comebacks days or months later. Edward had even more severe repair challenges: bad lighting, minimal magnification, long supply chains, poor lubricants that dried and decomposed, and greater variations in metal supplies and parts. Many of Philadelphia's watershed 18th century events are discussed in my book, not only for context, but because almost certainly Edward witnessed or directly participated in them. To the relief of city residents, the Paxton Boys crisis in 1764, you see here, was diffused in Germantown. Franklin and other leaders, perhaps including Edward, convinced a mob of Pennsylvania frontiersmen not to invade Philadelphia to press their demands for more protection against French and Indian incursions. Edward probably witnessed the local militia nervously mustered 2 blocks from his home. Parliament's 1766 repeal of the Stamp Act was celebrated with bonfires, barrels of beer, State House banquet for 300 people, outdoor feast for another 430. Edward probably ate and drank with the crowd. In 1774, we know that he was on a committee of local mechanics, let's go to that one, who were planning responses to Britain's closure of the port of Boston following the Tea Party. However, his name does not appear again on those committees, unlike David Rittenhouse, who later was vice president of the local committee of safety. David issued this urgent alarm about the approach of General Howe's British Army. Long after the Revolution, when Edward was a prosperous farmer, he contributed his expertise to a 1797 publication about fertilizer. In a question and answer format, he described his successful use of plaster of Paris to improve his crop yields. Also known as gypsum, this chemical remains in use today to stimulate plant growth. My book's final chapter, preceding the catalog, discusses Edward's close connections with Benjamin Franklin, 24 years his senior. Edward's boyhood home was next door to the family of Franklin's wife, Deborah Reed, where young Benjamin first boarded when arriving in Philadelphia as an apprentice running away from his older brother's print shop. This drawing, mounted for today's visitors on the wall of Franklin Court, show their adjacent dwellings back in 1723. This busy map of old Philadelphia, published in 1952, a great year when I was born, by the APS, shows the location of those next-door neighbors, marked by my blue square. Edward's later home was a short northerly walk away at my blue and red square. In the early 1750s, when Franklin's shop also served as the local post office, he and Deborah recorded 9 transactions with Edward. These appeared in a new APS database built from the shop's ledgers. In the days when the receiver, not the sender, was charged for the postage, young Edward paid for mail arriving from New York and Boston. I wish that we could know what he got and from who, but at least we can picture him striding up to the counter to ask the Franklins for his packages. For 50 years, Edward's mother-in-law, Mary Parry Smith, was a dear friend of Deborah Franklin, and the family member here who owns this portrait, she's in the audience tonight, and I thank her again for making this image possible. And the image originally was thought to be Edward's wife, but it's not, it's his mother-in-law. So this is, again, Edward's mother-in-law. Sally Franklin confirmed their 50-year friendship in a letter to her father. She was probably the closest friend of Deborah Franklin, was the mother-in-law. Sally and her family stayed at Benfield for extended periods. We see in another letter she wrote of her strongest attachment to that family. And this is Sally, Franklin's daughter, some years later in 1793, certainly when Edward still would have known her. Edward's sister Sarah married Ebenezer Kinnersley. He was Franklin's close collaborator on their famous experiments with electricity. Kinnersley lectured extensively on the subject throughout the colonies. He was also an important faculty member at the Philadelphia Academy that Franklin was instrumental in founding. Franklin often sent warm regards to the Duffields in his letters from overseas. You see his mention of George Washington in this one as well. He mailed seeds to Edward, and we know that he visited the London shop of the famous longitude clockmaker John Harrison, who you see here. In a package that Franklin sent to his wife, he enclosed a Harrison book for Franklin, our ingenious friend, as Patrick mentioned earlier. Edward expressed his thanks to Franklin for the book, but again through Deborah. I'm sorry there's no written words directly between two friends on this historic subject. I mean, it's unfortunate that we don't have letters, but we know that we don't have all the letters because researchers 30, 40 years after Franklin's death found his letters being used for sleeve patterns by tailors and being handed out by someone that had a pile of them. So it's possible that the Duffield Franklin letters were in those lost letters now. After Franklin returned to America from his long stay in England, when he'd finally despaired of reconciliation with the mother country, the first draft of the Declaration of Independence was discussed at Edward's estate. Franklin was recovering there from a gout attack in June of 1776. Jefferson and Adams traveled to Benfield for the meeting. Edward, no doubt, was there as well, and he probably did more than just pour the Madeira. Franklin designed the first continental currency, the Fugio dollar. He urged citizens to mind your business and to get to work battling the British and build a new nation. Fugio is Latin for it flies or time flies. Perhaps in consultation with Edward, he included a sundial and the sun's rays shining on it to reinforce his point of no idleness while the sun shone. Edward produced this sundial, the only one by him we know of, dated 1757. As required for accuracy, he calibrated it for his city's longitude 40 degrees north of the equator. He may have used this highly detailed engraved instrument to regulate the clocks and watches. Sundials were the most reliable timekeepers of the day. Although Edward was described in this 1960 George Eckhart article as Franklin's clockmaker, an Englishman, John Whitehurst, better deserves that title. He was an eminent horologist who Franklin visited several times in Derby. Whitehurst crafted prototypes of the three-wheel clock that Franklin designed in an attempt to make simpler and cheaper clocks. But as we can guess, the confusing dial limited its appeal. I have no idea what time that says. So, but Franklin did. Duffield clocks reportedly descended in Franklin's family, but there's no records of Franklin ever purchasing one. The makers of clocks are not identified in Franklin's estate inventory, as clocks rarely were in those documents. We see that David Rittenhouse was one of the appraisers of Franklin's possessions. Most often noted about Edward is him being one of the three executors, as Patrick mentioned, of Franklin's will. This confirms their long friendship and mutual trust. In a codicil to that will, Edward was gifted Franklin's French Waywiser. These were early odometers that recorded miles that the user had traveled. This one, owned by the Franklin Institute, probably is the one that Franklin attached to a carriage wheel, I think 13 feet in diameter, during his long-distance postal inspections on the eastern seaboard when he was the British-appointed postmaster. It has registered about 1,600 miles. Before I close, I should say how excited I was to discover some original Duffield ephemera near me at the American Antiquarian Society in Worcester, Mass. I recently was elected as a member of that venerable institution founded in 1812. This 1801 almanac clearly belonged to Edward, and they have no idea how it ended up in Worcester. He signed his name on the cover, and he made notes on blank pages about barrow making that he contracted. These men's names appear elsewhere as his tenants. I've seen no other papers with so much of his handwriting. Edward died July 12, 1803, aged 73. I'm sad that I could find no published notices, obituaries, or eulogies. He's buried in the graveyard of the All Saints Episcopal Church in the Torresdale area of Philadelphia. He worshiped there later in life near his Benfield estate. I'll be speaking at that church on this coming Saturday afternoon. His table-style tomb is at the center, marked with my red cross. I took this photo when I paid my respects. His wife, 2 daughters, and 1 son, Edward Jr., who we saw in that Peel miniature, are resting with him. Other descendants are there too, including 2 of Edward's great-grandsons under those broken columns. They were Confederate officers killed during the Civil War. Their branch of the family had moved south a few decades before the war. At Christ Church next week, where I'll be speaking, I can point to where Edward and his family sat and worshiped. I and my listeners will be sharing the same sacred spaces that Edward did nearly 3 centuries ago. However, we need not be sitting at those sites to feel Edward's presence. We can commune with his clocks in museums and historical societies and here at the APS. This again is the Duffield clock at the Met, where I recently admired it another time in one of their newly reinstalled Americana galleries. If we're even more fortunate, we have a Duffield clock. Let's see, it's coming. Where's my clock, please? I had it? Yep. Sorry. I got too excited about thinking about my Duffield clock. There it is, yep. Okay. Oh, wait, but this is why I jumped ahead. This is my Duffield clock on the catalog page of my book. That's right. See, I only rehearsed this about 3 hours ago, and already I forgot this part. Okay, so this is my Duffield. I am its trustee until somebody new in the future can share it. You see its past owner, Mary Williams Brinton, who passed away in 1992. Her house on Delancey Street is now the Rosenbach Museum and Library. The Rosenbachs live next door. In her privately printed 1972 autobiography, Their Lives and Mine, she wrote of this family clock that was purchased by her grandfather in 1878. And fortunately, there was still paperwork inside the clock that revealed this. Otherwise, I would have had no idea who had owned my clock before me, because the dealer didn't note it. So what she wrote in her book about this clock, a great intangible masculinity clings to grandfather clocks, usually good timepieces. The old ones have untiring energy and keep ticking something of the past life of a former generation. Such a one is in our upstairs sitting room. And someone from the Rosenbach is here, and I am visiting there and hoping to kind of visualize where this clock was. The interior's been totally changed, but maybe I can still commune with it somehow. So finally now, there's the Rosenbach, and perhaps one of those windows upstairs is the room where the clock sat. Now the clock stands in my Andover home, and when I gave this talk previously, I brushed right by the fact that my wife's giant bay laurel tree is standing next to the clock, but now I've promised to note it too, because it's the third one of these we had, and they all grew from about 4 inches into these massive bay trees, and we regularly pluck the leaves off for our spaghetti sauce. So we've got our own interior garden. But anyway, of course, the much more important item is the Duffield clock. Yeah. So I think about Edward and how fortunate I have been to learn so much about his life when I wind his clock every Sunday, and when I hear its constant, steady ticking as I write this talk, and when I lift my head every hour to hear the ringing of his bell. Thanks again to the APS and to all of you for attending in person and online. Thanks.
Thank you. We'll take a few questions.
Uh-oh, this is going to be a tough
No,
one.
no, it's not. No. No, but it's really fascinating that somebody that was so prominent, so well connected, left so little correspondence. And I didn't know if you could just speculate on why you think that is.
I do have a hint that there seemed to be a troubled relationship between Edward and his oldest son, who was the physician Benjamin. And as you'll read in my book, there was a sad letter that young Benjamin wrote when he was in France. He wrote it to Franklin asking to borrow some money to get home. And it sounds like his father had cut him off. And he said, you know, my father, he's kind of, I forget the exact word, but he kind of implied that he wasn't that educated a guy. You know, his limited resources, something like that, that even though later on we learned he was a reading man and all, you know, I have his son's actual words saying, you know, Dad, he's kind of narrow-minded and, you know, can't express himself that well. That's sort of the feeling of it. So I think it's possible that Edward just didn't write that many letters. You know, he deferred to his colleague at the Bray Associates to send the letters or the reports, only one letter when the guy was out of town. So I think, you know, that's at least one explanation, because you'd think others would exist. But of course, there's still probably stacks of them in that trunk that the descendant's going to bring tomorrow and prove everything I've said is wrong. So I hope not. Anyone else?
How complicated a clock could he make? I mean, with how many different features?
That's a good question, and it's also one I address in the book because, you know, I didn't want to do too much denigrating almost. I mean, it's not really denigrating, but compared to what Rittenhouse did or what Isaiah Lukens did or a few other people, Henry Voigt, for example, that made exotic things, orreries with many complications, basically all of Edward's clocks are the same standard designs. He made time and strike 8-day, 2-weight movements. The one exception, I suppose, is that regulator that he made for the transit of Mercury. But it's nothing exotic, and the odd thing about that is that when it was made, it was claimed that he included a kind of an innovative temperature compensating pendulum, which would indicate that he had some additional building abilities besides just putting English clock parts together and finishing them and making them work. But the pendulum with that clock now at APS is not a temperature compensating pendulum. And someone who looked at it maybe 40 years ago also said this is not a temperature compensating pendulum. So, you know, who knows what happened to the original, because I think APS back in 1769 paid him for a compensating pendulum, and that pendulum's gone. But to go on too long to what should have been a short answer, there are no known extra complicated clocks like some of his colleagues were making, particularly Rittenhouse. He wasn't really known as a scientist. He didn't create the tables that went into almanacs like Rittenhouse did and Benjamin Banneker did, for example. So again, I think he was a clockmaker. He repaired a lot of clocks and watches. And then in 1775, he said, I'm going to go live on my estate and be a farmer. And that's what he did.
Thank you. This was a very Anglo-British North America story. Is there a larger context from Europe or other parts of the world in clockmaking? Did the French were making clocks in the same way, or the Italians, or?
Absolutely, yes. And I go into this in greater detail in my book, but for almost a century before Edward started selling capers, the business, France, Switzerland particularly, and England already had tremendous divisions of labor and making them all by this way. In those Swiss villages during the winter when they couldn't be farming, there wasn't one guy in his chalet by the north-facing window making every part of a watch. He was sitting there making the same wheel, 100 times a week and passing them on to the finisher. So that was the way things were done. Certainly, there were French clocks being made in great profusion at this same time, but the British did not want us to import French clocks. So there's very few French clocks that arrived at the time of Duffield's work. And the same with watches. My next book is about the Mulligan family of clockmakers, and with them I have located 3 of their account books, and a lot of them were watch repairs from a bit later in the 18th century, and with very few exceptions, they were all English watches which were being serviced and repaired by American tradesmen. Because it just, even at the beginning, the Mulligan book deals with the predecessors, almost from the Mayflower on. But the clockmakers that came over still were not taking that lump of steel and brass and making a clock out of it. Those were already almost being done by specialists and assembled and finished by other specialists. So that was the way it happened. And at the beginning, there was some blowback as people were looking at the drafts of my book, saying, why the heck are we talking about Duffield if he just, put stuff together? What makes him a clockmaker? And their point was valid, and I had to emphasize, partly from my 40 years at the bench, that this is no simple matter. This isn't a guy standing in an assembly line in Dearborn, making a Ford Fusion. This is somebody who sits there and, with great difficulty, either makes them work for the first time or makes them work 14 more times as the soot in the air and the cats knocked the clock over, all kinds of repair jobs that had to happen. Again, too long an answer, but as you see, I've thought about these things too. Thank you for the question.
Thank you. Thanks for the talk. At 4th and Pine, there's a church there that has a memorial stone with a Duffield name on it in the interior, though, but as a prominent. Do you know anything about that at all?
There were definitely other Duffields, all descended from Benjamin who came. So there were, so Edward had a bunch of cousins here too. One of them married Jonathan Gosselow, who was the cabinet maker that I mentioned. George was a Presbyterian minister. Sam, yep.
Okay, that's probably it.
Yes.
He's probably, I think they memorialized he was the pastor of the church.
That makes sense. And Samuel was a local apothecary and doctor. So there were a lot of Duffields around, and there were actually several Edward Duffields that made my job a little complicated too, because suddenly one of them would pop up in somebody's militia, in 1780. And meanwhile, Duffield did not serve in the American Revolution. He bought his way out. If you were rich and you didn't want to get a musket ball between the eyes, you could pay for a substitute. And so Edward did not carry a gun. I mentioned this in my book too, because the militia he would have been involved with was involved in the Battle of Brandywine. and he may not have come home from that excursion because the militia was placed in the front and the Continental regulars were behind them saying, you guys charge the British first and we'll mop up, and it didn't go so well. So, thank you.
I think we're out of time.
Okay, you
One
don't want
more?
to, you got to let her ask
We'll
a
let
question.
Kim ask questions.
Yeah, that would be a risky person
I
to
know.
cut off, I think. Yeah. And I look
Sorry.
forward to meeting you too shortly.
Yeah, I actually have two related questions. One, where it's about the cabinets, and were there sort of fashion trends that made people choose different kinds of cabinets? And what happened when the clock was put into one of those cabinets and he had to repair it? Did he have to go to somebody's house, or did they bring it to him and take it out of the cabinet?
Both good questions. The first one, my book's catalog is organized by case style because that's roughly chronological. So, the Chippendale style came later with the broken arch and the scrolls up top. So there were fashions, but one thing to keep in mind is that the Quakers, at least some of them, did not believe in overly being ostentatious about their wealth. So some of those cases would be less ornamental and carved and gewgawed up just because they were for Quaker customers. So, the variety of the cases is kind of startling because they went from quite plain to quite ornamental, and that explains their value now, because frankly, most people buy antique clocks like this for their cases, because they're beautiful pieces of Philadelphia furniture. So, and the plain ones can maybe, this is not the Antiques Roadshow, but the plain ones can sell for 10 grand, and the one that they bought for Maury Heckscher at the Met sold for like 400 grand because the case is much more ornamental. So there's that difference. Secondly, what I've done for the past 40 years, part of it was servicing those clocks in the same way that Edward would have, where if it's minor servicing, you can do it on the customer's kitchen table. But if you're taking the clock apart, you don't want the kid and the cat and the silverware in the way. But you don't take the whole case home, and I have to explain that to most of my tall clock case customers, is that I show up with my little wagon and I remove the movement out and I take it home, and when I'm testing it, I have a test stand that simulates it being inside the case so that I can run it with the expectation that it will work in the case, which it usually does when it goes back to the customer. And, a few times people are nervous, oh, you're taking my clock away, but mostly they're so grateful that they found someone still that will fix it. And I think, my reputation makes them somewhat comfortable with that. But, the last thing you want to do, some clockmakers still do that, where they'll go in, but mostly they're not taking it down to every last part, because I've looked for clock parts on Oriental rugs too many times in my life to want to do that in somebody's house. So I'd rather be in my shop where it's a nice smooth white floor where whenever something falls on the big bench, I can find it. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
All right, no rebuttal?